Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time in the first hour here talking about the Islamic State, known as ISIS, and really trying to give you a better understanding of its history and its intentions and what we need to do to respond to it. Robert Spencer has a new book out called The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS, and he has been on the program with us many times before. He is the director of Jihad Watch, and we've had him on the program to talk about his best-selling book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, as well as, more recently, his book on the truth about Muhammad, as well as Onward Muslim Soldiers, and many other books that he has written. He's an individual that is an expert in this field. He has spent more than 25 years studying Islamic theology, law, and history. Also spends a fair amount of his time training, for example, the FBI and other government officials on the threats of jihad in America. Robert Spencer, always great to have you on the program.
Great to be here, Kerby. Thank you.
Let's give a little history. We've done some of this before because we've talked with you about this and we've talked with other guests, but it would be good to go back. I don't know how far we want to go back, whether we want to go all the way back to the Taliban and Omar, or whether we just go back to Zarqawi and Osama bin Laden. But explain, if you could, for just a few minutes, because you do a very good job in the book, of the history of ISIS. How did we end up with this Islamic State that we have here today?
Well, Kerby, a lot of people think this group just seems to have come out of nowhere and suddenly is dominating everything. But actually, if you go back, the Islamic State, or ISIS, is the old Al-Qaeda in Iraq group. And you may remember Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the Iraqi jihad leader who was killed by an American airstrike in 2006. He was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was, as it turned out, more fierce than Al-Qaeda proper. And Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda at that time, the number 2 man in Al-Qaeda, he had disputes with Zarqawi, the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, chiefly over whether it was a good time to establish a caliphate in Iraq or not.
Yes.
They both wanted to do it. They just didn't agree on when. And Zarqawi was killed, but his group went on with its plan to establish a caliphate in Iraq. They did so. The Al-Qaeda group that they split from turns out to have been wrong. They said you shouldn't do it because the Americans will strike it right away, and they haven't. And so the Islamic State has established a caliphate. The caliphate is, according to Sunni Islam, and that's most Muslims in the world, the only legitimate government to which any Muslim owes allegiance. And so you've got quite an appeal there in the basis of on the basis of the caliphate that is drawing Muslims from around the world to join the Islamic State.
Sure. I want to talk about the caliphate in just a minute. Of course, you have whole chapters on that. But just for, again, some of our listeners that may have a little difficulty kind of sorting this out, we have Sunni Muslims, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, are Sunni Muslims. Of course, you'd find Sunni Muslims in Saudi Arabia and in Turkey, although ISIS would disagree with them, so we'll get to that in just a minute. And they would be different than Shiite, which you would tend to find more in southern Iraq and Iran. And explain that difference, because, as I've said on the program, and I think you would agree with me, one of the greatest threats to any Muslim in the world is oftentimes another Muslim.
Oh, yeah. Well, see, in Islam, heresy and apostasy carry the death penalty. And so if some Muslim thinks that you're not the right kind of Muslim, you could be killed. And this is why there's been 1,400 years of conflict between Sunnis and Shiites, and a lot of conflict between other Muslim groups. They're always fighting each other because they consider the others to be heretics who they have to kill. And the problem in that the Islamic State poses is that there were other organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood that wanted to establish a caliphate. They were not able to do so, but now they view the Islamic State as competitors. And of course, the governments of Muslim countries, chiefly Saudi Arabia, and also Turkey and the others, they're directly threatened by the Islamic State, since the Islamic State challenges their legitimacy to exist at all.
Yes.
And so they're all at odds with one another.
You know, one of the things I've said to people before, and I'd love to have you verify this, is that the Islamic State, or ISIS, if they could make their way into Saudi Arabia, they would destroy what is considered the holy places, the Kaaba and the whole area in Mecca and Medina. And so this shows you the dramatic difference between the Islamic State and their views and, say, the views of other Sunni Muslims there in Saudi Arabia.
Well, the funny thing about the Saudis is that the Islamic State is essentially their baby. They spread this understanding of Islam around the world. They spread the idea that all shrines were illegitimate, that Muhammad had condemned and cursed those who prayed at shrines, and yet they have these two big shrines at Mecca and Medina. And so, yes, the Islamic State would destroy them on the basis of the version of Islam propagated by the Saudis themselves.
I know, it's just a really interesting irony, but that always gets people's attention because I said, could you imagine how that would change tourism in Saudi Arabia? Because every able-bodied Muslim is supposed to spend at least one time in their life going on a Hajj or a pilgrimage, and that would obviously change things dramatically. And it, I think, illustrates again what sort of an anomaly ISIS is, which brings me to the question that runs all the way through your book. Is the Islamic State Islamic? And you say in your book the same thing I sometimes say. It's like asking, is the Pope Catholic? But we've had a lot of individuals, and you know it only so well. It's not just our president, but it's our Secretary of State, and it is all sorts of prominent individuals. It's the former Prime Minister in Great Britain and all the rest that say that ISIS, or the Islamic State, is not Islamic. How do you respond to that?
Yes. Well, the Islamic State itself bases everything it does on Islam, and has published a great deal of material explaining the Islamic basis for what it does. And I think that our leaders are doing us a disservice and doing our response to ISIS a disservice when they ignore and deny this material. You cannot defeat an enemy that you refuse to understand, and that's the situation that they've put us in. The Islamic State, everything that they do, even the most outrageous and repulsive things, the beheadings, the sex slavery, it's all in the Quran. And certainly there are other Muslim groups that do not do it, but that's precisely how the Islamic State has been appealing to peaceful Muslims around the world, and to even jihad-minded Muslims, saying, look, we are the authentic Muslims. We are the ones actually doing what the Quran says in these particulars, when other Muslim groups don't dare.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, though, I want to get into some of that, because the argument is that they're killing innocents, and the Quran does not allow that. Of course, I know that you have some answers to that. Or killing other Muslims is not appropriate. Of course, I know you have some response to that as well. Then we'll get into this idea of the caliphate, because, again, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi established that last year. And what does that mean? And then ISIS coming to America, a very important chapter in the book that helps us understand that we need to recognize that this is not just an issue for the Middle East. Of course, it is an issue that we've talked about in terms of all the refugees streaming into Europe right now. But what about the threat of ISIS to America? And you've heard us in the past quote from the individual that has been looking at this quite a bit, the FBI director, James Comey, saying that they have found evidence of radicalization in all 50 states. So we have a lot to cover today. But also, because we are so blessed to have an expert like Robert Spencer with us, we're going to open up the phones in just a few minutes to give you a chance to ask your questions, because no doubt you have some questions about ISIS, about the Islamic State, about what we can possibly do and how to respond to this. And, of course, it has created a massive humanitarian crisis, and we've tried to raise funds and have been successful in doing so to help those in refugee camps. So there are lots of different aspects of the conversation today. And so we encourage you, first of all, to go to the website, pointofview.net. That will give you more information about Robert Spencer. If you click on his picture there, it will take you to jihadwatch.org. Of course, you can find a way to get the book there, also get some of his other resources. And if you'd like to know a lot more, we have that on the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. Robert Spencer with us today. The book is entitled The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS. It's published by Regnery. We'll continue our conversation with him and then with you right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Taking a stand for traditional marriage can be bad for business. Chick-fil-A found this out. Liberal mayors don't want these restaurants in their city, and they were nearly shut out of the Denver airport until common sense began to prevail. Chick-fil-A left the Denver airport years ago and then applied to return. It was one of the most popular food concessions, but they weren't popular with a few members of the city council. One councilman argued, "We can do better than this brand in Denver at our airport, in my estimation." A councilwoman feared that the chain would use its profits to fund and fuel discrimination. They were willing to send Chick-fil-A packing, even though one study predicted the restaurant would generate more than $4 million in sales and put over $600,000 a year in the city coffers. Approval for Chick-fil-A should have been a simple process, but a few city council members resisted because they disagreed with the company's, quote, business practices, unquote. What might those be? Well, back in 2012, its now CEO Dan Cathy supported traditional marriage and opposed same-sex marriage. Can you imagine if a conservative member of the city council, assuming there is one, opposed Starbucks because its founder supports same-sex marriage? Imagine the intolerance. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, but it wasn't because the city council members backed down. Denver attorneys in a closed-door meeting warned that barring a business on the basis of political prejudice would result in a First Amendment lawsuit they would most likely lose. Also, there was the issue of race. Chick-fil-A's local partner is a minority-owned business called De La Rosa Restaurant. Chick-fil-A might have won this small battle, but they're still facing the intolerant left in cities like Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. Political leaders want to bar their restaurants in these cities. Fortunately, Chick-fil-A was able to prevail in Denver. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Giving Films, 90 Minutes in Heaven, based on a true story, in theaters now, rated PG-13. More information at 90minutesinheaventhemovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking today with Robert Spencer as his new book is out, The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS. He is a best-selling author, and of course you may be familiar with some of his previous books on the truth about Muhammad and the politically incorrect guide to Islam, Onward Muslim Soldiers. This one also published by Regnery, and it's one that I think you'll want to get a copy of, and we have quite a bit of information about it on the website pointofview.net, which will link you back to jihadwatch.org. Robert, let's, if we can, for just a minute, deal with some of the arguments, whether it's Howard Dean or President Barack Obama or others. They argue that, well, Islamic State is not Islamic. They're not Muslim. It's a cult, but it's not a Muslim cult because they're killing other Muslims. You sort of address that, but get into that in a little more detail, because some people say that because they're killing other Muslims, they can't possibly be any kind of real Muslim organization.
Kerby, this argument has some superficial plausibility because the Quran does say that Muslims must not kill other Muslims. However, it also does say that Muslims must kill heretics and apostates, those who deviate from the truth of Islam. The Islamic State is claiming authority over all Muslims in the world by declaring itself the caliphate. And so when it kills other Muslims, it kills them for not accepting its authority, for not obeying it. And that is something that obviously the Muslims that are being killed, the people who from the Muslim groups that have been killed, they reject it because they reject the authority of ISIS. But from an Islamic theological standpoint, given what they claim to be, it's perfectly reasonable on the basis of Islamic teaching.
What about this idea of killing innocents that, again, is used as an argument against Islam being anything related to the Islamic State? But again, if you look at the Quran and the Hadith, that is permissible, isn't it?
Yes. This is the problem with a lot of these controversies over this kind of thing, that Muslim clerics will say, oh, Islam forbids the killing of innocents, but doesn't tell you that it doesn't consider non-Muslims to be innocent. that every non-Muslim is somebody who's an enemy of Allah in rebellion against the law. Now, this is where there's legitimate disagreement, and there are some Muslim clerics who disagree with this. But there are Muslims who believe it, and there's certainly ample basis on the authority of the Quran and the example of Muhammad to argue this way, because there's no concept in the Quran or the Hadith, the stories of Muhammad, of non-Muslims rejecting Islam in good faith. They are always depicted as being dishonest, as knowing the truth of Islam but not wanting to accept it for reasons of monetary gain or some other shameful impulse. And there's no concept of good faith among non-Muslims in the Quran. And so the idea that they're innocent is something that is extrapolated. It's not in there.
Let's say we can talk about that. What happens when then they run into innocence? Let's say that we talk about ISIS making their way into Mosul or Fallujah or something like that. They go in, they find a Christian home. They'll put the Arabic name or the letter N there for Nazarene. But if they are challenging individuals to accept their view, they require them to say what, the Shahada? What would it require for an individual to escape being executed by a leader of ISIS?
They have two choices, actually. The Christians in that position, they had two choices. That was to say the Shahada, as you say, which is to say there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, and then they become Muslim. Or to accept dhimmi status, which is the status of being the so-called protected people who submit to the rule of the Muslims and are denied basic rights, but they're allowed to live as long as they pay this tax into the Muslim treasury from which the Muslims are exempt. And that is the status that most of the Christians rejected when they were offered it in Mosul and elsewhere. Many of them were able to flee. Many of them were killed. But there are some actually still there who are now paying the jizya, the special tax specified in the Quran and Islamic law, for the non-Muslims who submit to Muslim rule and accept the second-class status.
And again, for somebody might say, well, this is just something ISIS has implemented. If we go back through the history of Islam, dhimmitude, or being a dhimmi, was something that was practiced quite often with Jews and Christians, was it not? Yes,
absolutely. Throughout Islamic history until 1856, when the Ottoman Empire, the last great caliphate, abolished the dhimma under pressure from the Western powers, who were appalled at the mistreatment of Jews and Christians in Ottoman domains. And it's in the Quran that this tax should be levied, and that the Christians and the Jews should be made to feel themselves subdued and be subjugated under the rule of the Muslims. It's in the example of Muhammad, and so there's no way that any honest Islamic authority can say that this is not Islamic. It's just that it was set aside, and Islamic hardliners, of which, of course, ISIS is one example, have always said that the setting aside of dhimmitude was a grave mistake and a rejection of Islam, and they wanted to restore it, and now they have.
So again, if they were to take over more land, or even we're going to talk about ISIS in America, the goal there would be to have a caliphate, to basically impose Sharia law, and those who are pagans, either they submit or be killed. Those who are the so-called people of the book, they would live under dhimmitude, correct? And all of us would be under that Sharia law implemented by the caliphate, true?
That is their plan for the whole world, absolutely.
Wow. Again, we can talk about some of the prophetic aspects of that in just a minute, but I think there's always another question that people start asking about: how has this become the most powerful group, which at one time was referred to, at least by somebody, I think, as a JV team, but nevertheless, how is they, obviously they might be extracting some of this from the jizya, but talk about what happens when ISIS takes over a town in terms of what they use the banks, the oil fields, and others for, because various individuals have been on the program talking about the fact that it may be the wealthiest terror group in history. Yeah, there's no doubt about it, it is. And that's because when they take over a territory, they swiftly go into the banks and commandeer the cash and the gold, whatever there is in there. And they go to the oil wells. They control quite a few oil wells now. And they're able to sell black market oil to countries in the region that love the low prices and don't care about the moral questions involved. And so they have become the wealthiest and most powerful terror group in the world. Meanwhile, the United States has been streaming in weapons to their putative enemies. Now, the first enemies to which we were streaming in weapons was the Free Syrian Army.
And the Free Syrian Army, Obama said, was moderate and would fight ISIS. But most of the time, they actually collaborated with ISIS and gave them the weapons. And so they have a great deal of military materiel that comes straight from the United States and was designed to be sent to people who were going to fight them. Either the U.S. Underestimated the closeness of the groups that we had deemed moderate to the Islamic State, or these groups were weak and were quickly defeated by the Islamic State and everything they had was seized.
Well, it seems to me that some of the weapons that they were able to obtain were actually in Iraq, ones that we left behind either because we left too quickly or else because we assumed that they would be in good hands with the Iraqi army. But I believe that ISIS now has access to those too, don't they?
Yes, quite so, absolutely. And enormous caches of weapons and ammunition that we left for the Iraqi army, that the Iraqi army lost to the ISIS group, or that rogue factions of the so-called moderates just gave to ISIS. In any case, we're their chief financiers, in effect.
We're going to come back from the break and to give you a chance to join the conversation today. The number is 1-800-351-1212. The book is entitled The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS. You can click on the picture there of Robert Spencer or simply go to his website there, which is available at jihadwatch.org, and you can find out more about the book. It's available in paperback or Kindle. And we'll also, when we come back, get into a couple of other issues that are very important. First of all, we're sort of alluding to this idea of the caliphate, but the Islamic State really wants to fight the Battle of Armageddon right now. They have a timetable for conquering Rome, a timetable for conquering Israel. So what does that mean, and how does that play into some of the prophetic ideas that we've talked about on the program before? We'll also get into some of the other misconceptions people have had. One of those misconceptions is that ISIS is not Islamic. I always love that. The Islamic State is not Islamic. But okay, let's take another one. That the individuals in ISIS that are being recruited by ISIS are all coming from poverty, from dead-end lives, and as a result, they have no other choice. I think you're going to find out that that certainly is not the case. And, of course, we'll also talk about some of their strategy. We talked about already the possibility that they can kill other Muslims, they can kill innocents. Can they ever lie? Can they ever not tell the truth about their plans, about their strategy? These are just a few of the many ideas that are in this book. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about ISIS, and I'd like to read it in an engaging style, this certainly has that. Very similar to the politically incorrect books that we've enjoyed over the years. It has various watches there, ostrich watch and tequila watch and all that. And we'll get into some of those aspects. So it's really quite fun to read through the book. The ostrich alert is one of those where many times you just shake your head and say, there are a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of people in our government that are sticking their heads in the sand. So you'll learn from those materials as well. But if you'd like to join our conversation, no doubt you have some questions about Islam, about ISIS, about our conflict in the Middle East, you're welcome to join us. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
From Provident Films and Affirm Films comes War Room. Tony and Elizabeth Jordan's marriage is turning into a battle, and their daughter is caught in the crossfire until Elizabeth meets Miss Clara.
This is my favorite place in this house. I call it my war room.
And learns that prayer is a powerful weapon. War Room. Now playing. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at warroomthemovie.com.
As you fight in your war room, please include Kerby and Point of View in your prayers. We have a very important opportunity right now. A wonderful friend has said that he will match every gift in September up to a total of $50,000. Point of View needs that support to keep equipping you for your life inside and outside your war room, both as you pray and as you live. So please call now and give generously. 1-800-347-5151 or online at pointofview.net. That's 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station.
And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Robert Spencer with us today as we talk about his book, The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS, and we'll take some of your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Go to Texas first, KABX. Brent, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yep, thanks for taking my call. Here's my question. I work with three Muslim fellas and pretty open to, my view as a Christian and their view as Muslim. But I recently, and in my discussions with them, I asked them, what justification do the ISIS Muslims or any Muslim look to in the Quran to justify their violence? And their answer to me is always, there is no justification in the Quran, and that Muhammad never committed violence or harm to anybody. And I recently heard, recently heard...
Just look at Surah 9, just the 9th chapter in the Quran alone will get you there. But okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Surah 9?
Yeah. But anyway, we'll let Robert answer all that in just a minute. Go ahead.
Okay. The specific... I heard an ex-Muslim speak in Houston a few months ago, and he specifically made a claim that Muhammad killed a man... and he bled out, and then he raped his wife in the bloody ground. And I cannot find any other reference to that. And I wondered if your guest knew of a specific a place I could go to show that to my Muslim friends at work.
Sure, Robert.
Okay, the closest that I can think of to that. Let me tell you first off that the Hadith are the stories of Muhammad, his words and deeds. And I have 30 volumes of the Hadith here in my office, 30, and I don't have all of it. And so there might be some story out there that's like that I have not heard, but the closest I can think of offhand to that is when the Muslims raided the oasis of Khaybar, where there were Jews living in Arabia, and he had Kinana, the treasurer, tortured to give up where the treasury was. And then he took Safiya, who was Kinana's widow, after Kinana had been killed, and took her as one of his wives and consummated the marriage right there on the battlefield. So that might be what the Imam was referring to.
Sounds like
the lurid detail about the bloody ground, that part I have not heard before.
Yeah. But the broader issue is, even in the Quran, even before you get to the Hadiths, just in the Quran itself, can you not find many examples where, again, Muhammad calls upon them to go out and slay the infidel, and all sorts of other kinds of statements that are found in the...
Absolutely. Kill them wherever you find them is 3 times in the Quran. Chapter 2, 191, chapter 4, verse 89, and chapter 9, verse 5. The verse that mandates that Jews and Christians must be fought against until they're subjugated as inferiors. That's chapter 9, verse 29. Beheading is justified by chapter 47, verse 4. When you meet the unbelievers, strike their necks. There are many, many other verses of this kind that call upon violence. And then Muhammad, who is exemplary in Islamic law, you take how he treated a tribe of people who he thought had rebelled from him and from his rule, and he had them staked out in the desert with their hands and feet cut off on opposite sides and left to bleed to death in the desert under the burning sun and denied water. And he had the 600 to 900 members of the Qurayza tribe, the Jewish tribe, who he thought had betrayed him, and he had them line up along a trench, and he beheaded them. These things are in the Islamic sources. Your friends there are just taking advantage of their confidence that they figure you don't know what's in the Islamic sources, like most Americans don't.
And again, I would recommend that if you wanted to interact on these issues, 2 books that certainly come to mind: The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam, which has been out for many years, and then, of course, this new book we're talking about here, The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS. But again, as I said just a minute ago, just take the so-called verse of the sword, Surah 9:5. That would be enough to, I think, set aside the argument that your 3 Muslim friends make. So, Brent, I appreciate you asking that question. I'm going to get into a couple of other questions real quickly, but before we do, because we already have a pretty good bank of phone calls, I did want to talk about this timetable, because ISIS has this timetable for conquering Rome and for destroying Israel. Can you explain that to us?
They intend to do that by the year 2022. Rome by 2020 and Israel soon after 2022. That is within 5 to 7 years. Now, people might think, well, these people are nuts. There's no way they're going to be able to do that. But remember, they're not talking about doing it by warfare. They're talking about doing it by means of subversion, by means of infiltrating. For example, they threatened last February to send 500,000 refugees into Europe, and now they're doing it. Now, people might say, oh, no, these refugees, they're not all jihadis, but the Islamic State just recently boasted that they have already 4,000 jihadis among the refugees, and that more are coming. And there are discoveries all the time. Just today, there was found an Islamic State handbook for the refugees about how to act when they get into Europe and how to conceal that they are jihadis and so on. And in any case, this is how they hope to do this. They hope to bring about, by getting all these jihadis into Europe, the conquest of Rome, do the same thing in regard to Israel, and then bring about what they hope to be the final battle between the Muslims and the non-Muslims in the year 2025, 10 years from now, that would be at a town called Dabiq, which is in northern Syria, and is the name of their magazine. Because of this, they attach so much importance to this, that in Islamic tradition, there's a prophecy attributed to Muhammad that the final showdown between the Muslims and the non-Muslims will take place at Dabiq. And they think that after they conquer Rome and Israel, that the United States will come and be determined to destroy them there. And that'll be the time when Jesus, the Muslim prophet, will descend from heaven and fight and destroy Christianity and conquer and Islamize the world.
Isn't that amazing? Because, again, as we've talked about sometimes on this program, we've talked about prophecy. Islam has its own eschatology. It has its own view of Jesus. It has its own, if you will, Armageddon, and all of that is there. But since you mentioned the various Syrians right now, let's take one of these phone calls that's related to that. Robert in Georgia, I think you wanted to address that issue, so you have the floor.
All righty. Thank you for letting me in on this. I'm down in South Georgia. I've been working and living in Paducah, Kentucky for years, but since I came home to Georgia, I found out that just several miles from our community here in Baxley, there's an Islamic training camp, or whatever type training camp it is they put together. And now I'm hearing from in church and from the government and everybody, we're going to accept 10,000 of the Syrian refugees in this land. Who's to say those people are not ISIS undercover waiting to give these people instructions to drive against the Christian faith in our land?
Again,
and that's about all I have.
Yeah, Robert, let me give you a chance to respond real quickly before I take another break.
Well, ISIS has a handbook for people. I analyzed it in the book for Muslims in the West on how they should not be overtly Islamic, not carry Qurans, not have long beards, but appear to be secular and just wait for the right time to strike, which is exactly what your caller's talking about.
And he's talking about some of those terrorist training camps. We've talked about that a little bit before. Robert, maybe I didn't hear that, but that's not ISIS. But again, some of these, if you will, co-belligerents, individuals that have as their end the destruction of America, could work together in some kinds of activities like that, could they not?
Oh, absolutely. It's not ISIS, but it isn't as if they have any disagreements. It's just they're two different organizations, but they're completely allied in terms of their outlook on the world and their views of Islam and of the United States.
Well, we're talking about immigration. Let me take one more phone call before we take a break. Up in Missouri, I think, Dave, you wanted to talk about that. He's listening on KCMH. What would you like to say?
Why don't we pass an immigration law similar to the Chinese Exclusionary Act of 1882 to keep the Islamic Muslim types out of this country?
Because that would be seen as politically incorrect, right, Robert?
Yes, it would be racist and bigoted and Islamophobic and all these things, these words they use to scare people off what has to be done. The fact is that there is no way to tell a Muslim who's peaceful from a Muslim who is a potential jihadi, and so it's a national security issue to let all these people in. But given the present political climate and the current government in Washington, there's absolutely no chance that any law like that could be passed.
Well, and again, we've seen what happens when indeed you have a group of individuals. We can look at the Somali population in Minnesota, or some of the other ones that we can pick out are the large number of, for example, Muslims in Dearborn, Michigan. Even in the midst of those who might have a desire to be peace-loving, all it takes is one or two radicals to intimidate the rest to go along. And after all, they aren't looking to get their heads chopped off. So it doesn't take of a majority, if you will, of radicals. It only takes a few to sort of bring the others along. Isn't that fair?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And look, you can just see from the anti-ISIS demonstrations, you would expect that if this is something that the vast majority of Muslims really reject, that they'd be rising up against it. But for precisely the reasons you outlined, they are doing nothing. They say they condemn it, and yet there was a demo recently in Toronto, and it was Muslims against ISIS, and they had 50 Muslims show up. And that was the most that any Muslim group has been able to get, whereas hundreds of thousands, literally, will demonstrate against cartoons of Muhammad and things like that.
Sure.
But they're not. If there are Muslims who are peaceful, they're not standing up to this.
We'll take a break and then talk about some of those incidents and why it is growing. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Robert Spencer as we talk about his book, The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS. Already it is listed as the new bestseller in the history of Islam category. And, of course, in the past, he's had New York Times bestseller books. This was probably destined to be one of those as well. So if you'd like to know more, you can go to jihadwatch.org and get some more information about him, about the book, and we certainly have all those links on our website. Robert, answer this question. You do it very well in the book, but I'd love our listeners to know this. We are always told that the people that join ISIS, and the reason ISIS is really beginning to grow is because these are people that come from poverty. They're kind of in dead-end jobs or have no job at all. And so that's the attraction of ISIS. Yet if I look at the leadership and many of those individuals that we've mentioned just in passing, these are sometimes individuals that had studied at universities with even sometimes advanced degrees. Some come from fairly wealthy families. That kind of puts a lie to that idea that the only reason we have radical Islam is due to poverty.
Yes. It's an insidious lie, but it's absolutely deeply entrenched in the U.S. government, and the U.S. government is committed to the policy of showering money upon Muslims in order to get them to not be jihadis. It's foredoomed. It's never going to work, but it never stops the State Department before, and it's not going to stop them this time.
That's for sure.
The reality is that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph of the Islamic State, the Caliph Ibrahim, he has a PhD in Islamic studies. The Islamic State, because of the lure of the claim to be the caliphate, has gotten doctors from Australia and from the UK to join it, very wealthy people of considerable education, and it continues to do so. The idea that they're only going there because they lack economic opportunities, I think, is just a means that it's a point that is advanced by Muslim groups in the West in order to get more government money.
Well, it's just, again, a very sad commentary. And maybe back to the question that Brent asked just a minute ago, where the three Muslim friends said, there's nothing like that in the Quran or the Hadith. You have a whole section called the Jihad Watch, and that's the idea of lying. And it, I think, is something that our listeners need to understand, that you are given permission to lie to others, to misrepresent the nature of Islam. And that doesn't mean that all Muslims do that. I'm not painting with a broad brush, but it does mean that when a radical Muslim is being interviewed, or in some cases when those who are actually hoping to, through subterfuge, bring down the United States or another country, tell us that Islam is a peaceful religion, they know that they're not telling the truth.
Right. They're trying to foster complacency and ignorance so that we don't deal with the threat as it really exists. But this is in the Quran. Certainly it's true that not all Muslims do it, but it does say in the Quran, do not take unbelievers as your friends and protectors in preference to believers unless you're doing it to guard yourself against them. And that unless you're doing it to guard yourself against them is explained in the commentaries, the Islamic commentaries on that passage, as meaning we smile in the faces of some people, but behind their backs we curse them. And we do this so that we will be able to gain an advantage over them in the ongoing war between us and them.
Well, again, that's just another one of those pieces that I think many of our people need to understand. And back to what's happening here in the United States, we've talked before about how if you were to be a jihadi, if you wanted to actually join a radical group, you'd have to leave this country. You'd have to go to Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, wherever you might go. You'd have to learn the language. You'd have to suffer hardship. But ISIS has become very sophisticated in terms of social media, and they can use the dark web and other ways to actually recruit individuals here in the United States. And you have quotes from individuals that say, we came from your country, we're now radicalized, and we look forward to killing you in our own home country. So this radicalization is now taking place in large part through the internet, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And it's not just the deep or dark web. It's the Twitter, Facebook. The Islamic State appeal to young Muslims is very sophisticated in that way. But we have to remember, it's not the medium, it's the message.
Yes.
And the message that it's the caliphate, that's what's appealing to them. And just in August alone, there were cases in California, New York, and Mississippi of young Muslims trying to join the Islamic State. There are other Muslims all around the country who have been caught trying to plot murder of Americans in the United States because of calls from the Islamic State. And so their appeal is very profound. And for our leaders to wave it away and say they're not Islamic is foolish in the extreme.
Well, again, we have an FBI director right now that has basically said that anyone listening to this broadcast lives in a state where there has been some level of radicalization that has caused him and the FBI and Homeland Security to be concerned.
Yes. And so we have this escalating threat, this spiraling difficulty, and yet our leaders are in denial about the motives and goals of those who caused the threat.
Well, and again, we have an election coming up, so I think it's important to ask not only presidential candidates, but senators and members of Congress, and even people in your legislature, since a lot of this has happened at the state and local level, what they think about this issue and what they think about ISIS and what they plan to do about it. I think those are really good questions. But just before we let you go, Robert, I always like to have you spend just a minute talking about the resources available at Jihad Watch. There are individuals that for the first time may just be hearing this. We've picked up a few radio stations even since last time we've had you on. And they might say, I didn't even know there was an organization looking at all of this. So talk about what's available to some of our listeners.
Thanks, Kerby. It's Jihad Watch is an organization dedicated to shedding light on the motives and goals of jihad terrorists and their activities, violent and stealthy, in the United States and around the world. And so it's a news and commentary site. You'll find a great deal of information that's updated many times daily. And it helps to situate not only what is in the news, but why it's happening and what the mainstream media, especially, and our government officials are not telling.
Well, again, we had a couple of people calling in wanting to know what to do, and we've given them a couple of action items. One, I think, is to get a copy of this new book, The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS, over 300 pages. So if you really wanted to have something that goes into this, but it's got a very nice, easy, readable style and has some breakout and blow-up quotes and things like that. So I think you'll find it very easy to read and very easy to follow. That would be helpful, especially if you find yourself interacting with members of Congress or with local officials or maybe other Muslims, and they're saying, well, now, where'd you get that? I mean, I think you're going to find this to be a very helpful book. And, of course, I do commend to you some of the material there at Jihad Watch, because as we will have documented many times before, the problem isn't just over there. 15 miles from where I'm broadcasting right now is where two jihadis pulled out their AK-47s, and if it were not for a Garland police officer with a service pistol dropping them, we could have had a major massacre right there in Garland like we had with Charlie Hebdo in Paris. So again, it brings the reality close home to many of us that were in the same region where some of that took place. Robert Spencer, always great to have you in the program. Thank you for a good book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll change topics. But if you find yourself saying, oh, I want a little bit more, we have the book, and we have some articles that we've posted. If you said it came a little fast, or I'd like somebody to hear this again, I want to pass this on to someone, we have an opportunity on our website, pointofview.net. You can either listen to it again on our podcast, you can watch it again on our live cast. Go to our YouTube channel. By the way, I'd really encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. I did it years ago when we first got it started. How long has it been? Maybe it's just only been a year. It seems like that. But nevertheless, that then just puts it up there so that I can see it when I go to YouTube. Oh, I forgot about this one. Or maybe I wanted to go back and look at an interview that I did or one that Penedextra did when maybe I was out of town. And so you can do the same thing and have access to those resources. So go to our website and you'll find all sorts of great resources. And if today you said, I learned some things I've never heard before, then that's maybe one reason to think about whether or not you might want to support this ministry. We do need your financial support, and we have an opportunity right now to actually have your gift to Point of View doubled because of a very nice, generous gift from one of our donors who wanted to encourage us in this month to give. So if you've ever thought about giving, this would be a good time because your gift of $50 becomes $100. Your $100 becomes $200. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Please remember September, the month that your gift to Point of View will be doubled. Give $25, it becomes $50. Give $50, it becomes $100. One of the ministry's very special friends wants to motivate you to give, especially if you've never given before. No gift is too little nor too big. Please give generously. Help us equip believers to represent Jesus Christ in this very important and critical hour. Call now and give 1-800-347-5151 or online at pointofview.net. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net.
From Provident Films and Affirm Films comes War Room. Tony and Elizabeth Jordan's marriage is turning into a battle, and their daughter is caught in the crossfire until Elizabeth meets Miss Clara.
This is my favorite place in this house. I call it my war room.
And learns that prayer is a powerful weapon. War Room. Now play. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at warroomthemovie.com.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about anger, and that is something that is so misunderstood. Oftentimes people think, well, you're never to get angry. Well, does God get angry? Well, I think so. Did Jesus ever get angry? Yes. Okay, so there may be a positive basis to anger, but we also see how devastating anger can be in a family relationship and in a marriage. So we're going to talk about what's God's purpose for anger and how maybe we can process the anger we might have in a positive way. How to deal with individuals that maybe are angry with you, how to address the issue of anger in your children, in your spouse. There's a lot that we're going to cover, and it comes from an individual that we have talked with so many times here on the program, Dr. Gary Chapman, probably best known, of course, for his 5 love languages and his 5 love language series, as well as his radio program and all the various aspects of that. Of course, he's a speaker, a writer, and a counselor, and director of marriage and family consultants, and he is going to really, in a sense, help us deal with this issue of anger. So, Dr. Gary Chapman, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's good to be with you again.
Always good to have you on the program, and love your basic common sense biblical perspective on this. And anger is, I guess, one of those topics people might not have think you would write about because you're so known for love languages. But as a counselor, you well recognize that one of the biggest issues to address when you're dealing with marriage and family issues is this issue of anger, isn't it?
Well, you're exactly right, Kerby. I think many marriages have been destroyed by mismanaged anger, and many children have been greatly hurt by mismanaged anger on the part of their parents. So this whole issue of understanding anger, where it comes from, what's the purpose, how do we channel it in a positive direction, the whole thing is just extremely important in having healthy family relationships.
Might just mention that we have information about your book, which is just out, published by Moody Press, so look for it in your local bookstore. Of course, there's a way you can order as well. But also we have a video about 2 minutes long, which I encourage people to watch, and then maybe click on the share button. They can put it on their Facebook page and start a conversation, pass it on to some others that need to hear about that. And your argument in the video, and it shows up a little bit later in your book, is that there are really two kinds of anger, because there is the anger that is justifiable from a biblical point of view, and then there is the anger which is an overreaction oftentimes to the fact that we have in one way or another had somebody abuse us or take advantage of us, or it's in some way or distorted. So we need to recognize that we're not starting out with the assumption that all anger is bad. We just recognize that most of it ends up being that way, right?
Yeah, I think Kerby, ultimately anger, I believe, is a gift of God. And I think it grows out of the reality that we have a concern for right. As you mentioned earlier, God, the Bible says God is angry every day with the wicked. And I think the reason God feels angry is because the wicked violate his principles that he's laid out for us. And when they do, they hurt themselves, they hurt everybody around them, they ultimately hurt the kingdom of God, and God feels anger. And I think we feel anger for the same reason. We have this sense of right. Even if we're not a Christian, we have a sense of right. And when our sense of right is violated, we feel angry. And so, that kind of anger is wholesome, is good, is a gift of God. But just as Satan has twisted and distorted every gift of God, he's also twisted and distorted anger. And so not all of our anger grows out of a violation of what is right. Often it's simply we didn't get our way. You can see it in a 4-year-old.
Sure.
Asked for a candy bar and didn't get it, and they get angry. It's not legitimate anger. It's that they didn't get what they wanted. So we have both kinds of anger as an adult as well.
But even at a young age, kids sometimes have a sense of justice, too. That's not right. You promised. That's not fair. And you talk about that. But you have a section here on when anger can be good. And I thought that was good just to mention for a minute, because we're going to talk about the negative aspects. But certainly what made Jesus angry, you deal with that. You talk about a mother's responsible to a terrible wrong, and that's mothers against drunk driving. You give another example, of course, of William Wilberforce standing up against slavery. And, of course, we could add to that Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement and on and on and on. That chapter is a reminder that anger channeled in the right way sometimes leads to positive social action. And that's something that we should not hide or dismiss or diminish, because those are very important actions that have led to greater justice in our world.
I really think that's true, Kerby, that in that sense, many of the great reformations in culture have come because people felt angry. People said, this is not right, and they took action to right the wrongs. And as you mentioned, Wilberforce and others, it took years and years for that to really happen, but at least they were moving in the right direction. All great social reform really is born out of anger. But as you know, Kerby, and I know, even anger at social issues can be handled in a positive way or can be handled in a negative way.
Let's talk about that, because you have a chapter on when you're angry for good reason. You can even be angry and be good and angry, as some people like to say, but then you can respond inappropriately and thus miss the opportunity of that gift that God has actually given to you. So let's talk about that for a minute. We're going to be focusing most of our time and attention for the rest of the hour on the negative aspects of anger. But for just a minute, if somebody is upset about social injustice, maybe they weren't paid what they felt that they deserved, somebody violated them in some way, and so they have a right to be angry. They actually are following, if you will, a biblical principle in their anger, but how do they prevent from using the wrong means to address it in a positive way?
Yeah, and I think that's what we've seen. When people are burning buildings, for example, and setting cars on fire, that's not, the anger might be legitimate over what happened, but it's not helping the situation. It's making things worse. And now other people get angry at them for what they've done because what they did was wrong. So, that's why I think the Bible says, being angry, sin not. Whether it's a social issue or whether it's a personal thing that's been done to you, we may well have legitimate anger, but don't sin in that anger. Take steps that will be positive. And the biblical pattern is, on a personal level, if someone has wronged you and consequently you feel angry with them about it, if they don't come to you immediately and apologize, you go to them, Jesus said, and you confront them. And if they repent, you forgive them, and the whole thing's resolved. So always, God's purpose is that the legitimate anger, what I call definitive anger, is for the purpose of motivating us to take positive steps to make things better. And often, of course, we take steps that make things worse.
And again, I think the value there is sometimes to take some time, first to acknowledge that you are angry, but restrain yourself from taking an initial reaction. Proverbs 29 says, fools vent their anger, but the wise quietly hold back. Really begin to think through what's the appropriate response and maybe take a more constructive action item. So indeed, you may have been harmed. Your anger may be positive, but you can blow the opportunity, if you will, by sometimes taking the wrong action in the midst of that anger. So we're going to take a break, and we'll come back and spend some time getting into that in a little more detail, but then also looking at the negative aspects of anger. And that is, of course, what is tearing marriages and families apart, certainly destroying the cohesion even of football teams and businesses and all the rest. So we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Gary Chapman about anger. We'll do that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Taking a stand for traditional marriage can be bad for business. Chick-fil-A found this out. Liberal mayors don't want these restaurants in their city, and they were nearly shut out of the Denver airport until common sense began to prevail. Chick-fil-A left the Denver airport years ago and then applied to return. It was one of the most popular food concessions, but they weren't popular with a few members of the city council. One councilman argued, "We can do better than this brand in Denver at our airport, in my estimation." A councilwoman feared that the chain would use its profits to fund and fuel discrimination. They were willing to send Chick-fil-A packing, even though one study predicted the restaurant would generate more than $4 million in sales and put over $600,000 a year in the city coffers. Approval for Chick-fil-A should have been a simple process, but a few city council members resisted because they disagreed with the company's, quote, business practices, unquote. What might those be? Well, back in 2012, its now CEO Dan Cathy supported traditional marriage and opposed same-sex marriage. Can you imagine if a conservative member of the city council, assuming there is one, opposed Starbucks because its founder supports same-sex marriage? Imagine the intolerance. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, but it wasn't because the city council members backed down. Denver attorneys in a closed-door meeting warned that barring a business on the basis of political prejudice would result in a First Amendment lawsuit they would most likely lose. Also, there was the issue of race. Chick-fil-A's local partner is a minority-owned business called De La Rosa Restaurant. Chick-fil-A might have won this small battle, but they're still facing the intolerant left in cities like Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. Political leaders want to bar their restaurants in these cities. Fortunately, Chick-fil-A was able to prevail in Denver. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Giving Films, 90 Minutes in Heaven, based on a true story, in theaters now, rated PG-13. More information at 90minutesinheaventhemovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Life is full of frustrations, and sometimes it's easy to get angry, even blow a gasket, but that's why we're talking about the subject of anger today. The book is entitled Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion, and it is written by Dr. Gary Chapman, and it is published by Moody Publishers. And Gary, we were talking about the positive aspects of anger, but even there, we have to be very careful that our response, even when we may be justified in being angry, is one that is God-honoring.
Yeah, and I think that's always the objective. If we follow God's plan, what does God do when God gets angry? Okay, typically he sends a spokesman to the people at whom he's angry and says, you've broken God's law, and God is angry with you, and if you don't turn around, God's going to bring punishment. And God's desire is they will turn around. Nineveh is a good example of this. He sent Jonah. And if they turn around and repent, God forgives them. So that's a good example for us. We should always reach out to the person at whom we're angry and extend the hand, hoping that they're going to repent and confess and apologize, and we can forgive them, and the relationship will be restored.
The Bible has a lot to say about anger. Proverbs 14:17, a short-tempered man or a short-tempered person do foolish things. And Proverbs 19:11, sensible people control their temper. We have a lot of those examples in the Proverbs, but in your chapter on when anger is wrong, you even tell us the story about Naaman in 2 Kings. And Naaman was an angry person, wasn't he?
Yeah, it's another example of someone who got angry, not because a wrong was committed, but because it wasn't done their way. He was a leper, and he was advised to go to Israel, to the prophet of God, and that he would pray to God, and his leprosy be forgiven. So he went over to see Elijah, and he sent out a servant and said to him, hey, just go dip 7 times in the Jordan River, and you'll be clean. And he got super, super angry. He said, I have rivers in my country. Why are you sending me to the dirty Jordan River? He went away angry because the prophet didn't do it his way. In fact, he actually said, I thought he would come out, hold his hand over my prophecy, pray to his God, and heal me. Since he didn't do it his way, he was angry. And finally, somebody prevailed and said, look, why don't you try what the prophet said? Go dip in Jordan and see what happens. He did, and he was healed. So many biblical examples of that. Cain got angry with God because God didn't accept his sacrifice, and he accepted his brother's sacrifice. But the real issue was he didn't offer the sacrifice God required, and God had already told him that. So, there are biblical examples and many examples in our own lives when we get angry because we simply did not get our way.
Well, and another aspect of that, you can see it with Naaman, you can see it with David, you can see it with the Egyptian Pharaoh and others. If you're in a position of privilege, as a leader or a king would be, they're used to getting their own way. Now, let me extrapolate that. Okay, none of us are kings, but most of us live in a world where we do pretty much get our own way. We live in a world of convenience here in the 21st century, so we're used to basically having everything the way we want it. And when we go in and order coffee, we know exactly how it's supposed to be. And when we put something in the microwave, we expect it to take only a certain amount of time. That's one of the reasons why you find individuals in the 21st century getting angry over what I call first world problems that you would never even think about if you lived in the third world. And so in some respects, this issue of anger is not diminishing in our world because more and more of us live in a life of privilege and convenience. More and more of us are going to probably run into anger and maybe even exhibit it ourselves.
I think that's true, Kerby, and especially in marriage. Before we're married, we do things the way we want it done. We get married, we anticipate our spouse will do things the way we want them done. Yes. Simple things like loading a dishwasher. I remember in my own life, I got super angry with my wife by the way she loaded a dishwasher. I'm a very organized person. I believe the dishwasher should be organized in a certain way. My wife would load the dishwasher like she was playing Frisbee, And I gave her lectures about, God is a God of order and whole issue, and she said, honey, I'd be really happy for you to load the dishwasher, and you can do it your way.
Yes. Well, that brings us to one of the principles you talk about, that is negotiating and understanding, to sometimes say, this really bothers me. And so whether it's the cap on the toothpaste tube, or whether it's the way in which you load the dishwasher, or how you use the remote control on the television, or where you park your car in the garage, whatever, sometimes there just needs some open conversation in what you call a non-judgmental atmosphere.
Yeah, and you have to acknowledge, first of all, that anger is not legitimate anger. I was mad at my wife simply because she wasn't doing it the way I wanted it. She didn't sin. It was no sin the way she was doing it, So you have to recognize that first and acknowledge to God, forgive me for being so self-centered that I have to have everything my way. It's a sign of immaturity. But then you can still go back and negotiate. You can go back and talk about it. You know, honey, I really did feel angry when this happened, you know, and I know that it's not sinful, but it does irritate me. Is there any way we could negotiate? What could we do here? Is there a possibility you could change? Or maybe I just need to change my perspective. So it's okay to go back, especially in a close relationship like marriage, to go back and try to negotiate something that will work better for you in the future, and it will not continue to be, an irritation for you.
And I think there's another principle that we need to understand, and that is to have that open communication and not let it build up. And I think all of us at one time or another are guilty of that, where we finally explode, and it's been building for some time. But let's take a typical scenario that you talk about with Rita and Doug. That is, they both work, they come home, but, you know, he's always heading off with the boys, or he's watching football game, and she needs help with the chores. There needs to be some communication about the fact that I'm getting more and more angry, and sooner or later I'm going to be shouting about this because I expect you to do something in the household other than come and plop in front of the television set on the couch watching a football game.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that we allow anger to build up inside is because some Christians have the idea that it's sinful to be angry. Good Christians don't get angry. And so when they feel anger, they say to themselves, okay, I shouldn't be angry. And they just hold it inside. They don't talk about it. They don't try to negotiate. And if you hold it inside long enough, what you described earlier is what's going to happen. We're going to have a big explosion over something that may be trivial because we've allowed all that pressure to build up inside. So always the biblical pattern is you move out as quickly as possible and try to reconcile. In fact, the same passage that says in Ephesians 4, being angry, sin not, also says, don't let the sun go down on your anger.
Right.
That is, we're supposed to get rid of anger, rather quickly. Anger was designed to be a visitor, not a resident.
Well said. And you're really talking at this point about what you call explosions and implosions. And you said sometimes people say, well, what is that? Well, implosions usually have some characteristics. You call them denial, withdrawal, and brooding. With denial, I'm not angry, I'm just frustrated. Or I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. I'm not angry, I just don't like it when people do that. Well, sometimes the first step is to get off of the denial and out of the withdrawal part, but be willing to eventually have some meaningful communication in the midst of that implosion, right?
Yeah, the starting place is to admit that you're angry. And then the second place you've already alluded to, I think, is that we restrain our immediate response, because our immediate response is probably going to be detrimental. So you restrain that. When I was growing up, Kerby, my mother told me, son, when you get angry, always count to 10 before you do anything. Well, I think Mother was on the right track, but I would suggest you count to 100 or 1,000. 10 is not long enough.
10 is not long enough.
It's just a method of calming down and giving yourself time to think about it. One lady told me, she said, you know what, I decided that when I was angry, I was going to run and water my flowers. She said the first summer I did that, I almost drowned my petunias.
That's a great line. We need to take a break. When we come back, though, let's take another aspect of that, and that is the passive-aggressive behavior. And I'm sure there's some people listening right now that are shaking their heads. And then what to do when you're angry at your spouse, how to help your children handle their angry. And I appreciate you putting this in there, a chapter on, well, what if I'm angry at God? What about all that? Or I'm angry at myself. And most importantly, if I'm dealing with an angry person, how do I confront him or her? So just a lot of great practical information, as you would expect from a book by Dr. Gary Chapman. The book is entitled Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion, and it's available in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link so that you can find it there as well. And if you're an angry person or know an angry person, you certainly will want to have a copy of this book. There's even a personal anger assessment designed to help you see how you manage anger. So lots of great practical material in the book. But if you'd like to join us, we'll take some calls from those of you that would like to address this issue of anger. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. How can we, from a biblical point of view, handle anger in a way that honors God? We'll continue that conversation with Dr. Gary Chapman and you right after this.
Provident Films and Affirm Films comes War Room. Tony and Elizabeth Jordan's marriage is turning into a battle, and their daughter is caught in the crossfire until Elizabeth meets Miss Clara.
This is my favorite place in this house. I call it my war room.
And learns that prayer is a powerful weapon. War Room. Now play. Rated PG, parental guidance suggested. More information is available at warroomthemovie.com.
As you fight in your war room, please include Kerby and Point of View in your prayers. We have a very important opportunity right now. A wonderful friend has said that he will match every gift in September up to a total of $50,000. Point of View needs that support to keep equipping you for your life inside and outside your war room, both as you pray and as you live. So please call now and give generously. 1-800-347-5151 or online at pointofview.net. That's 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Gary Chapman as we talk about his book, Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take one of those phone calls. We'll go to South Carolina, WAGP. And Jerry, thank you for calling today. What's your question?
I am so in shock that I'm speaking to Dr. Chapman. You have been one of my Christian icons for decades.
Well, thank you, Jerry.
But that said, 21 years ago, I had a 5-year-old who was punching holes in his room with a pencil. And I had tried, there were up to about 50 holes, and I had tried spanking, lecturing, you name it. I get home, and I don't know why wives always seem to do this, but as soon as I walked in the door, my wife hit me up with there's 50 new holes in the wall. I went and I looked, and sure enough, there were about 50 holes in the wall. I went back, and this time I did something different. I went back, and I prayed, and I talked to God, and I spent 5 to 10 minutes praying and, admitting my sin, that I was angry, but this was not the right solution. It's in your hands, God, because I can't do this. And I walked over to speak to my 5-year-old, and he was scared because I spank hard. And he knew that was coming, and I didn't know what was going to pop out of my mouth. And I said, Tony, you are going to kiss and apologize to each and every hole in the wall. And we went to his room, and he wouldn't do it, so I shoved his head to the first hole, and he kissed it and told him he was sorry and he would never do it again. And we went through all 100 holes in the wall, and it never happened again. It's amazing what happens when God is in control.
That's quite a story.
That's a good story, yeah.
Well, Jerry, thank you for calling. Thank you for starting us off. And, there are solutions to this. And, of course, we'll jump ahead in just a few minutes probably to that whole section on dealing with anger that your children might have. But I did promise that we, just before we take another phone call, talk about this idea of a passive-aggressive behavior, because that is sometimes more difficult to deal with, because an individual say, I'm not angry, but then they do everything they can to mess your life up. And it seems to me that that's another aspect of implosive, if you will, anger, something that you address in the book.
It is, and often this happens in children, especially teenagers. If you have a very strong parent who says to a teenager or a 10-year-old, shut up, you're not going to talk to me that way. You go to your room until you can come out and show me some respect. Okay, they go to their room, but now that anger that they had towards you goes underground. And if you have a few of those kind of experiences where they're not allowed to process their anger with you, that anger goes inside, and it will show up in their behavior. So externally, they're passive, but internally, they're boiling, and eventually, it'll come out in aggression. And it comes out in all kinds of ways. With teenagers, they may become sexually active. They may try drugs. They may do all kinds of things. And it's not that they're consciously saying, I'm going to get back at my parents because of the way they treat me, but that's essentially what's happening, is that it's passive on the outside, but aggressive on the inside that shows up in their behavior. And that's why it's so important that parents learn how to help children walk through their anger, not just simply tell them to shut up and go to their room.
Well, and again, in your chapter on children handling anger, it seems to me that you need to focus on meeting the child's need for emotional love, because sometimes we're real good on the rules, but not the relationship. And, of course, you've heard that. Rules without relationship leads to rebellion. So it seems to me that the man that has taught us so much over the years about the 5 love languages needs to remind us that love is very key.
And I think, Kerby, that when we wrap our discipline in love, for example, let's say that the child has thrown the ball in the house instead of out in the yard, and that's against the rules. We're getting ready now to administer discipline. We've already told the child that if you do that, the ball goes in the trunk of the car for 2 days. And so if words is their language, love language, you say, Johnny, I love you so much, and I'm really proud of you, because normally you keep the rules. But, you broke the rule today. You threw the ball in the house. So you know what happens to the ball, right? I have to put it in the car. But listen, I love you so much, and I'm so proud of you, because normally you don't break the rules. And Johnny walks away feeling he was treated fairly, and he's far less likely to ever throw the ball again. But if you simply just grab the ball and say, I told you not to do this, give me that ball, it's going in the trunk of the car, Johnny walks away thinking, I try hard to do what's right, and I mess up one time, and my mother gets angry with me, or my father gets angry with me. So if we wrap our discipline in love, the child's far more likely to receive the discipline in a positive way and change their behavior.
And again, if you don't want to say that to a 5-year-old, you certainly don't want to say that to a 15-year-old. And that's something I've picked up from a number of counselors, including one that we just talked with recently. The tendency to sometimes not have an age-appropriate response to some kind of disciplinary issue, and find yourself sometimes talking to your teenagers like you talk to a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old. That's really going to lead to all sorts of rebellion, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. I remember the 13-year-old who sat in my office and said, my father yells and screams at me, telling me to stop yelling and screaming at him. When parents complain to me about their teenagers yelling and screaming at them, I normally ask, where do you think they learned that?
Yes. Yeah, and I think we know the answer to that one, don't we?
I have to do what I did. I had to say to my teenage son at one juncture, Derek, I'm not handling my anger very well. And you're not handling yours well, and I can't expect you to do something I'm not doing. So why don't we learn how to do this better? The next time you get angry with me, how about just coming and saying, Dad, I'm angry, can we talk? And let's sit down and see if we can talk rather than yelling at each other. And I'll do the same thing with you. I'll just say, Derek, I'm angry, can we talk? And that was really a huge turning point in us when I was willing to admit to my son that I wasn't handling my anger very well.
Very good. Again, we've talked about kids. Let's go back to one of the chapters on a spouse, and I have a caller here that would like to address that. We'll go to Missouri this time and talk to Jerry. You're on with Dr. Gary Chapman.
Yes, I have a severe marital situation. I feel it's gotten severe. It's a second marriage for me, third for my husband, and he goes into violent rages, and it's really escalating, and there's name-calling to me and put-downs, and it all stems from his refusal to put behind him any thoughts of my ex-spouse, which I was single for 15 years. And didn't date or anything because I was so afraid to make a mistake. And, and so he has built in his mind that this man is a threat to him or something, and accuses me if I want to go to a grandchild's birthday party or anything. He's made it so uncomfortable for everybody. But see, to himself, that's me lying, saying that they're uncomfortable or that he's done this because he thinks he's got people fooled. And he rants at me to the point of crushing me, and then I have to go into situations or visit my children, and I'm such a rattled mess, and of course they can catch on, and it's getting worse.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about boundaries here, and we're talking about maybe also your chapter on confronting an angry person. What thoughts would you have, Dr. Chapman?
Yeah, I think first of all we have to acknowledge that kind of behavior on the part of a husband is not appropriate behavior and cannot be accepted. So I think you say to him something like this, I don't know whether you feel my love or not. If you don't, I'm happy to talk about it, and you can talk about the love languages. Are you speaking his love language? Does he really feel your love? And if not, you address that issue because you want him to feel love. If he feels loved, he's less likely to be suspecting things of you. So I would take that approach first of all and tell him, you want him to know you love him. Maybe you're not doing a good job at that. But then having done that, and if you are speaking his love language on a regular basis, you're saying to him, I don't know how you feel. I really love you. I think I speak your love language, but the way you treat me is just not appropriate. And I don't know if you're willing to go for counseling with me, but if you're not, I'm going for counseling myself because I've got to have some help here. And you take that kind of step because the very next thing you need to do is show tough love to him. But you need to have a pastor or a counselor or somebody with you. I don't mean physically with you, but I mean walking with you through this process before you administer tough love to him. Because some people only respond to tough love, which says, I love you too much to sit here and do nothing. And if you're not willing to get help with this, then I'm going to move in with my mother, or I'm going to do whatever it is you're going to do. You take a strong step which says to them, I'm not abandoning you. I love you, but I'm not going to sit here and do nothing while you destroy yourself and destroy me.
Very well said. Let's take a break. When we come back, also that gets us into a conversation that you have in the book about forgiveness and dealing with that and how to sometimes deal with long-term anger, as well as a number of other issues and resentment. So we'll get into those quickly. And of course, if you want to understand this entire topic, I would certainly commend this book to you. Over 200 pages, published by Moody Publishing. It's available in your local bookstore, but we also have information on our website. Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion. Dr. Gary Chapman, he'll be back with us after this break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Gary Chapman with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Anger, Taming a Powerful Emotion. And Dr. Chapman, let's, if we can, talk about long-term anger. There are individuals listening to us that have been angry for some time about a hurt in their past that they are holding on to and are dealing with anger, maybe resentment. Maybe they're even dealing with depression because they've been holding on to it for so long. What would you say to those individuals?
Well, I think often this happens, and it's normally not just one offense. It's a whole series of offenses, maybe stemming even back to childhood. It may have been a mother or a father, a sibling, and other people along the way who have wronged this person. And the person either didn't know how to process the anger, or they tried and they were rebuffed. You know, a parent told them to shut up and whatever. And so they've held all this anger inside, and now they're adults. And one or two things can happen. they either move toward depression, the whole world is against me, there's no hope, I've been wronged all my life, or they explode. These are the kind of people who explode and sometimes do very, very rash things. And that long-term anger can be identified if you overreact to little things in life. If you're the kind of person, for example, you're sitting at a traffic light, the light turns green, and the little lady in front of you doesn't move, and you blow the horn at her, there's a good chance you've got stored anger inside.
For sure.
You overreact to little things. So I think those people, I really deal with this rather thoroughly in the book, because I think these folks really need help. And most of them, many of them are not aware that they even have a problem. They've lived with this so long. But I talk about how to go back and let God identify and bring back to your mind the people that wronged you and how they wronged you, and then release those people and release the anger to God. Turn it over to Him. He's the righteous judge, and just put them in His hands and let Him take care of them. And then you say, now teach me in the future how to handle my anger in a positive way. So it's getting rid of all that past emotion inside of us that really frees us up to become a new person.
I would say so, and that kind of leads us into forgiveness. Of course, you talk about how God forgives us and this issue of reconciliation and repentance, and there's a number of things that are involved in that forgiveness stage, is there not?
Well, there is. I think, first of all, there's an apology. Sometimes there's a confrontation before there's an apology. As Jesus said in Luke 17, your brother offends you, then you go to them, you confront them, and if they repent, He said you forgive them. Matthew 18, He says if they don't repent the first time, you go back a second time and take somebody with you and try again, and then the third time you tell the church and assume that they send somebody with you. If 3 times and they're not willing to deal with their failure, He didn't say forgive them. He said treat them as a pagan. What do you do with pagans? You pray for them. You do kind things to them. You return good for evil. Again, you're trying to be God's agent to touch their hearts. But forgiveness in the Bible is always a response to a sincere apology. And we, as Christians, we must always be ready to forgive, because God always forgives us when we come to Him with confession. David said, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. And we must be open. When people apologize to us, we must be open to forgive, no matter what they've done.
You talk about in the book that unresolved anger is very important to address, because it's something that can tear apart a marriage, really tear apart a family. So this is, I know, one of the reasons you wrote this book, because this unresolved anger, maybe even not being aware of the anger, and yet acting out and being so difficult around other family members as something that really can create a tremendous amount of strife in a relationship. And that's why we need to actually figure out how to tame this powerful emotion of anger.
It is, and I think, rather than putting ourselves down for feeling angry, we need to analyze our anger and say, where is it coming from? Did somebody sin against me? If they did, then I need to go confront them. But if it's simply that I'm not getting my way in these things, then I need to acknowledge that as self-centeredness, and I need to say to God, forgive me for being so immature here. So I think either way, whether it's definitive anger, you've been wronged, or whether it's distorted anger, you simply didn't get your way, we must process that anger. Otherwise, you hold the anger inside, it turns to bitterness, it turns to hatred, and both of those are condemned in Scripture. God never intended us to get that far down the road. We've got to process our anger so that we don't live with anger inside of us.
And even spiritual implications as well, because you have a chapter on when you're angry at God. I mean, it can really hurt your spiritual walk. It can hurt your relationship with God if you don't at least acknowledge that you're angry with God because some horrible thing might have happened in your life.
I think so. And, often with Christians, we pray for something that's really important to us, and maybe it's a sick family member, and then they die. And we feel like God didn't treat us fairly. See, again, the anger is a response to feeling we weren't treated fairly. And yes, we can get angry with God. Jonah got angry with God because God forgave the people in Nineveh. And he said, you made me look like a fool. I told them you're going to destroy this place. So we have a number of examples where people got angry with God. And I say, if you feel that way toward God, just tell God. You're not going to hurt God's feelings. He already knows what's going on in your heart anyway. Just tell God how you feel. And then having told God, listen to the still small voice of God, and you will likely hear him say, I understand, my son, you don't get it. You're going to have to trust me here. My ways are higher than your ways, so stick with me. I want to stick with you. And then we, with our pain, we walk with God through the process.
We're talking today with Dr. Gary Chapman. Let me just also encourage you to visit his website, 5lovelanguages.com, the number 5lovelanguages.com. Of course, we have a link to it on our website. You can find out more, not only about this book, but many of his other books, and there are ways in which you can follow his organization and benefit from some of the material that is available. We've posted one of the videos there for you to watch, so let me encourage you to watch that video. It's a little less than 2 minutes long, won't take you long. And then you can pass it on to others and maybe let them know a little bit more about the existence of this book, and maybe send them on a way in which they can apply and begin to process their anger from a biblical point of view and thus bring glory to God. So, Dr. Gary Chapman, always great to have you on the program with us here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I always enjoy being with you. You keep up the good work.
Thank you for joining us. Once again, Dr. Gary Chapman, you are, of course, most familiar with him and his 5 Love Language series, and there are a series of books in that regard. And this one, a little bit different, but it relates to so many of the conversations that we've had on this issue of marriage and family, anger, taming a powerful emotion. And it is published by Moody Publishers, and it deals with such things as anger that might be from a biblical point of view and might be justifiable when you're angry for a good reason, what to do when your anger is wrong and how to handle that bad anger. What about explosions and implosions? And we just talked a few minutes ago about anger that lasts for years and the issue of forgiveness, and then has some very good, very practical chapters on when you're angry at your spouse, helping children handle anger, when you're angry at God, and even I'm angry at myself. And then finally, a chapter on confronting an angry person. Lots of great practical material, very biblically oriented, and I would certainly encourage you to find out a little bit more about him. And so you can do so by going to our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll also see that we have our viewpoint section, our take action section, and of course information about the guests that we've covered here today. So we encourage you to go to pointofview.net. If you say, I'd like to hear this again, you covered some points, but I didn't have a chance to write them all down, you can download the podcast and listen to it, or you can watch the livecast at our YouTube channel on YouTube. And so they're just some great resources that we always try to make available to you so that you can benefit from those even as we go off the air. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Hope you enjoyed our conversation today. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Please remember September, the month that your gift to Point of View will be doubled. Give $25, it becomes $50. Give $50, it becomes $100. One of the ministry's very special friends wants to motivate you to give, especially if you've never given before. No gift is too little nor too big. Please give generously. Help us equip believers to represent Jesus Christ in this very important and critical hour. Call now and give 1-800-347-5151 or online at pointofview.net. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net.
From Provident Films and Affirm Films comes War Room. Tony and Elizabeth Jordan's marriage is turning into a battle, and their daughter is caught in the crossfire until Elizabeth meets Miss Clara.
This is my favorite place in this house. I call it my war room.
And learns that prayer is a powerful weapon. War Room. Now play. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at warroomthemovie.com.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love